Hello, joining me now is Safa Al Ahmad. She's a journalist and filmmaker. You're originally from Saudi Arabia, but you currently live in Turkey.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
So you have documented with your films uprisings in the Middle East. This is not an easy environment to film in. So tell us what the biggest challenges have been for you.
To tell an accurate story.
Yeah.
I think things are evolving so quickly, and you only get to see a tiny little glimpse of things, right? I mean, the luxury of a documentary is at least you get more time. So thankfully I'm not news, for example.
Where you have 3 minutes to tell your story,
exactly.
or 2.
Yeah, so the luxury of a documentary is you get to tell a more complex, fuller story. But even with that, I mean, a film that you would have made in 2011 in the Arab world,
is
right
different.
now, if you look back on it, I'm like, oh my God, you know, like, and so the challenge is of being honest and truthful and representative of the moment that you live in, and that's all I can do.
And having access, is that difficult? Gaining,
I mean, that's every journalist's question. It's like, do I have the proper access? Do I have the characters are properly representative of the story that I'm trying to tell?
Right.
And so most definitely access is vital.
It would
in
seem
these stories.
Even more difficult though in a situation
I
where
don't
there's
know.
political.
I don't think it's more difficult. I think it's just you need to invest more time in your relationships and your understanding of how things work together. Because I think, frankly, what used to be the case, for example, I work a lot in Yemen now. Every time I go back, it's almost reinventing the wheel of the relationships, of who's on the ground, who's left, who's in power and who isn't. And so it's always a very fluid situation, and you have to keep on your feet to kind of keep track of the real changes on the ground that have nothing to do with how the media is representing them, but exactly what's going on the ground itself, especially in countries. Saudi Arabia obviously is one of them, and Yemen is another one where there is very little media attention on the local issues that are happening. So it's kind of like you have to reinvent the wheel about what the story is once you hit the ground.
Right.
And so it's really challenging because especially like in Yemen, where it's become more difficult to get information than it was before, especially because of the war. So it's like you have to hit the ground and then you kind of figure out, okay, so what's really the story, right? Rather than one I just pitched, but you know, the one that's actually
pre-production has gone out the window at this point, right?
Exactly. Which
all your research.
Yeah. Don't tell my editor.
So obviously things are very fast moving. And you're probably learning a lot during the process. What surprised you as you've tried to tell these stories? Anything that surprised you?
How tenacious people are. How, like in 2010, when I look at myself and the people around me, and everything was so stagnant and depressing. As in, you always thought you will wake up in the morning and you watch the news, you always see Hosni Mubarak as the president of Egypt. You'll always see Gaddafi as the president of Libya, right? Like they're staples in your news items in the Middle East that you never thought you'd ever get rid of. They are gone. This is a massive change in the world, right? I know a lot of people like to say, oh, the spring has turned into winter, and I think that's really condescending because anybody who knows anything about history, about how long it takes to actually have real reform and change, takes a long time. Yeah, so it's really condescending to say, oh, you up. People. 2011 and that's it. Come on, I mean, France took 100 years. The Arab world, I think, will take another 500. But, there is things have to be taken in context of the challenges. So just because the protests have stopped in certain countries does not mean that people are still struggling for something that they did believe in 2011. And so the will to continue that, I think, is really important.
Is there anything you do differently as you've approached your films and producing them and trying to tell these stories?
Better cameras.
Buy the best camera you can afford, right?
Yeah, I mean, I went to the Tate Modern Museum in London the other day, and there was a French photographer who covered Afghanistan for a really long time, and he's like, I trick people with beautiful images to pay attention. And I thought that was a really powerful thing to say, because like in the beginning,
once you have their attention, you can tell them the story that they're listening.
Yeah, in the beginning I was like, I'm all hardcore and I'm going to take whatever tiny crap camera I have and I'm just gonna, it's all about the story, but actually we're in a visual medium where
it's true.
Having a beautiful image actually helps you carry through. And I think that is important. That is something I have come to, like, you have a beautiful image, people will stay with you longer. They're much more willing to see. I mean, the act of killing. He made us all care about Indonesia, about something that happened in the 60s, right? But because he had such a beautiful image, such a beautiful way of depicting the story, something that's quite horrific. I mean, he's talking about genocide, but it was so beautifully filmed. I think it's a testimony to how to do visual storytelling more powerfully.
Yeah. This is not an easy path that you have chosen, but what would you tell young women who are considering pursuing a career in filmmaking, who feel passionate about it, but are maybe dissuaded because of the obstacles?
No, I think being a woman is an absolute asset in this field. It's never been a drawback.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's being a man in this field is a drawback.
Really?
Yeah. No, I have no problem with being a woman, especially in the Middle East.
Why do you think it's a drawback to be a man?
Because then you get no access to half the population. I have access to everybody. I have equal access if I wanted to meet any man, any militiaman. I've been embedded with Al-Qaeda in Yemen. I had no problems. Yeah, but if a man wanted to get access to the woman, it would be much harder for them. They would have to work much harder on it. For me, I just show up and I get invited in and I have tea and coffee with the woman, and I get, I think, more in-depth stories, a filler perspective than the men do. And that's a privilege I have. I'm sorry to the men, but yeah, it's tough, but yeah, I think it is absolutely an asset.
Tell us about your experience being embedded with Al-Qaeda.
Fascinating. I mean, I'm from Saudi Arabia, so I grew up with religious police.
Sure.
And so there was this moment where I'm in an area called Azzan, which AQAP, Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula had taken over and declared an Islamic state in 2012. And there was a car driving around calling for prayer time, so then all the shops would have to close and all the men. And I'm like, oh, I was having this moment of like, this is so similar. This is, I mean, in Saudi Arabia, we have this exact same thing. The religious police drive around with their microphones telling people to go to pray. And it's just like this moment of how similar things are, even when you think you're somewhere completely different.
Yeah.
It was fascinating for me to see how they thought of themselves. They really thought of themselves as the first revolutionaries, the first people to go against the dictatorships of the Arab world, because, you know, like especially Osama bin Laden had gone against the Saudi government and stuff. So they didn't see themselves as disconnected from what was happening in 2011 with the rest of the Arab world. But in a weird way, in their heads, they felt that they were the solution to these things. So that was fascinating to me, just to see it from their perspective, as in to hear them with a straight face say these things. Yeah.
Well, it's wonderful that you have that access, because you're able to share that perspective with the rest of us. So Safa, thank you so much for sharing your story and for being with us today.
Thank you.